Everyone talks about Thermopylae and Salamis, 300 Spartans, Persian hordes crashing against Greek spears, but 600 miles west, on the same day, another battle decided the fate of the Greek world. 20,000 Sicilian Greeks against a Carthaginian armada carrying 300,000 troops. Nobody expected the Greeks to survive. The Carthaginians had the numbers, the money, and North Africa's best mercenaries. Yet by sunset on September 22, 480 BC, the coastal plain of Himera was soaked in Carthaginian blood. Their general burned in his own sacrificial fire. Their fleet went up in flames, and for 70 years, Carthage wouldn't dare touch Sicily again. How did this happen? Why does nobody remember it? And what did archaeologists dig up in 2008 that rewrote everything we thought we knew? Sicily sits at the crossroads of the Mediterranean, rich soil, natural harbors. Every empire wanted it. Greeks had been settling the island since 735 BC, when colonists from Chalcis founded their first settlement. By the 6th century, Greek cities dominated the eastern coast, Syracuse, Gela, Catana, powerful trading hubs. Meanwhile, Carthage controlled the west, Motia, Panormus, Saguntum, Phoenician outposts that funneled African grain and Spanish silver through Carthaginian hands. Between them sat Himera, founded 648 BC, a Greek city on the northern coast, right in Carthage's zone of influence. The city commanded sea lanes and land routes south across the island. That made it valuable. That made it a target. By 483 BC, the power balance was cracking. Gelon ruled Syracuse. He'd seized the city in 485 BC after backing exiled aristocrats in a civil war, then flipped on them and took control himself. Cold move? Effective move? He emptied smaller cities like Camarina and moved their populations to Syracuse. Half of Gela's citizens got relocated. The rich ones became Syracusans. The poor ones got sold into slavery. That's how you build an empire. Gelon now controlled the richest Greek territory in Sicily, and he had around 10,000 mercenaries on payroll. Men from mainland Greece, native Sicils from the interior, professionals who'd fought for his predecessor Hippocrates and stayed when Gelon took over. One inscription at Olympia mentions a mercenary named Praxiteles from Mantinea, settled between 485 and 480 BC. Just one name among thousands. Gelon married Demerita, daughter of Theron, tyrant of Acragas. Alliance sealed. In 483 BC, Theron looked north at Himera and saw opportunity. The city's tyrant Turillus had expelled the ruling oligarchs decades earlier and probably lacked popular support. Theron marched in and kicked him out. Turillus ran straight to Carthage. He had a xenia bond with Hamilcar, the Magonid Sufe ruling Carthage. Guest friendship. Political alliance. Hamilcar's family controlled Carthage's government and military. Turillus also had backup from Anaxius, tyrant of region across the strait in Italy, who'd married Turillus' daughter. Anaxius sent his own children to Carthage as hostages to prove loyalty. Message received. Carthage had treaties with several Sicilian cities, including Selinus and Zancle. The island was split into 3 blocks by 483 BC. Greeks in the east and south, Carthage in the west, Ionians holding the northern strip. The native Sicils and Sicyon stayed neutral. The Elymians sided with Carthage. Hamilcar spent 3 years preparing. This wasn't a raid, this was total war. Ancient sources claimed 300,000 infantry. Modern estimates say closer to 20 or 30,000. But still massive for the era. The force included Carthaginian citizens, Libyans, Iberians from Spain, Sardinians, Corsicans, Ligurians from northern Italy, and Gauls. Diodorus Siculus wrote about it in the 1st century BC, using earlier sources. The army sailed with 200 warships and 3,000 transports. Hamilcar loaded war chariots and cavalry, 4-horse Libyan chariots with disciplined crews, Iberian and Gallic cavalry trained for shock charges, Libyo-Phoenician horsemen with thrusting spears and round shields. It was a multinational war machine funded by Carthage's African and Spanish mines. The expedition left North Africa in 480 BC, heading for Sicily. Before they landed, disaster struck. A storm hit the fleet in the Libyan Sea. Herodotus and Diodorus both mention it. The transports carrying horses and chariots went down. Most of the cavalry drowned. The fleet limped into Panormus, modern Palermo, on Sicily's northwest coast. 3 days for repairs. Then Hamilcar marched east along the northern coast toward Himera, about 60 miles away. He had infantry. He had siege equipment. But he'd lost his mobile strike force at sea. That would matter. Hamilcar reached Himera in the summer of 480 BC and set up 2 camps, one by the shore to guard his fleet, one inland for the main army. The camps connected by palisades so supplies could move between them. Diodorus says, Hamilcar brought a picked force on reconnaissance and beat the Himerians in a pitched battle outside the walls. The Greeks fell back. Morale dropped. Hamilcar's foragers ranged the countryside, taking grain and livestock. The Greeks bricked up Himera's western gates and waited for relief. Theron commanded the defense. He sent urgent messages to his son-in-law, Gelon in Syracuse. Gelon mobilized. Ancient sources say 50,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. Probably exaggerated, but he definitely had a large force. Citizens from Syracuse and allied Greek cities formed the hoplite corps, heavily armored infantry with bronze-covered shields, spears, and short swords. Wealthier citizens provided the cavalry. Cycles and Sicans served as auxiliaries. Mercenaries filled the ranks. Archers, slingers, peltasts with javelins. Gelon took out loans from Syracusan citizens to fund the campaign. That detail tells you how serious this was. He marched to Himera in September 480 BC and made camp across the river from the city. Gelon's cavalry struck first. They caught Carthaginian foragers spread out across Himera's territory. No Carthaginian horsemen to counter them. The storm had seen to that. Diodorus says 10,000 Carthaginians got captured or killed in these skirmishes. That's probably high, but the raids worked. Morale in Himera improved. The Greeks cleared the bricked-up gates on Gelon's orders. Now they had three forces: Theron in the city, Gelon across the river. Hamilcar split between two camps. The Carthaginians had numbers. The Greeks had mobility. If you value documented ancient history and military archaeology like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from Diodorus Siculus's World History written in the 1st century BC, drawing on earlier accounts. Herodotus's Histories from the mid-5th century BC, which contains contemporary testimony. Archaeological reports from Stefano Vassallo's excavations at Himera, published through the Soprintendenza Archeologica di Palermo between 2007 and 2011. And genomic analysis published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in October 2022 by researchers, including David Reich from Harvard, which identified mercenary origins through DNA sequencing of soldiers buried in mass graves. These aren't generic overviews. These are primary archaeological publications and ancient texts cross-referenced with modern scientific analysis. Now back to the information. Hamilcar needed reinforcements. He sent a letter to Selinus, a Carthaginian-aligned Greek city to the south, requesting cavalry on a specific date. The letter said they should arrive when Hamilcar would be conducting a sacrifice to Poseidon at the naval camp. Greek deity, Greek ceremony, required Greek witnesses. That detail matters. Gelon's cavalry intercepted the messenger. They captured him and read the letter. Gelon saw the opportunity instantly. He'd send his own cavalry, disguised as the Selinus reinforcements. They'd infiltrate the naval camp, kill Hamilcar, burn the ships. Then the main army would attack the land camp while Carthage was in chaos. Simple plan. High risk, one shot. On the night before the appointed day, Gelon's cavalry left their camp. They rode around the hills south of Himera so the Carthaginians in the land camp wouldn't spot them. They approached the naval camp from the direction of Selinus at daybreak. Carthaginian sentries saw cavalry riding in. Expected cavalry from Selinus let them through the palisade. Fatal mistake. The Greek horsemen galloped into the camp, spears out. They started killing surprised Carthaginian soldiers before anyone realized what was happening. They spotted Hamilcar near the shore preparing his sacrifice. Altar, fire, offerings for Poseidon. The cavalry charged through and cut him down. Then they set fire to the beached warships. Flames went up, smoke visible for miles. Herodotus gives a different version. He says Hamilcar spent all day making sacrifices, trying to get good omens. When he saw the battle was lost, he threw himself into the sacrificial fire and burned to death. Polyaenus, in his stratagems, adds another variant. Says Gelon dressed his archer commander Pediarchus in his own clothes and sent him with archers carrying bows hidden in myrtle branches to offer sacrifice between the camps. When Hamilcar came out, they shot him down with arrows. 3 versions. Diodorus is probably most reliable because he's most detailed, and his version explains the cavalry ruse. But all 3 sources agree on the core facts. Hamilcar died at the naval camp. The ships burned. The Greeks saw flames from Himera and signaled Gelon. Gelon marched his main army out. Theron stayed in Himera with his force. The Carthaginian army left their camp and formed up on the hill west of the city. The Greeks had to fight uphill. Diodorus says the struggle was fierce and long. Neither side gained advantage for hours. Hamilcar's death and the burning ships hadn't reached the land army yet. These were disciplined troops, Iberian mercenaries especially, veteran infantry with short swords and heavy shields. The battle swayed back and forth from dawn toward dusk. Men collapsed from heat and exhaustion. Bodies piled up, no formations held, just grinding attrition. Then news arrived. Hamilcar dead, fleet burning. Some Carthaginian ships had already fled, overcrowded with panicked soldiers. The Carthaginian line wavered. Gelon's troops pressed harder. The Iberians tried to hold. For a time, they actually pushed the Greeks back, elite professionals refusing to break. But the rest of the Carthaginian army routed toward their camp. The Greeks pursued. Thousands died trying to reach the palisade. Thousands more got cut down inside the camp when the Greeks stormed it. When the sun set, the coastal plain west of Himera was carpeted with Carthaginian dead. Diodorus claims 150,000 Carthaginian casualties, impossibly high, but losses were catastrophic. Most of the army didn't make it home. Carthage sent ambassadors to Syracuse asking for terms. Gelon could have invaded North Africa. Carthage was preparing for that, manning walls and expecting Greek ships any day. Gelon offered mild terms instead, 2,000 silver talents, as indemnity paid over time. Construction of 2 temples at Himera to house copies of the peace treaty. No territorial losses for Carthage and Sicily. Why so lenient? Gelon had other problems. Greek tyrants didn't trust each other. Theron was his ally now, but how long would that last? Selinus and Region also made peace with Syracuse. Anaxius married his daughter to Hieron, Gelon's brother, diplomatic marriages locking in the new order. Tyrillus lost everything, never got Himera back, died in exile. The spoils were enormous. Gelon, Theron, and Hieron used captured slaves and war loot to fund massive building projects. Temple of Victory at Himera, Temple of Olympian Zeus at Acragas, planned to be one of the largest in the Greek world. Never finished, collapsed in an earthquake, used as a quarry for centuries. But the foundations are still there. 70 years of prosperity followed. Sicily became the richest part of the Greek world. Pindar wrote victory odes celebrating Gelon and Hieron. Gelon died in 478 BC, just 3 years after Himera. His brother Hieron took over. Syracuse dominated the western Mediterranean for decades. Carthage focused on Africa and Spain. No major Sicilian campaigns until 409 BC, when Hannibal Mago, grandson of the Hamilcar, who died at Himera, returned with an army and destroyed the city in revenge. But that's a different battle. For 2,000 years, Himera was a legend supported by ancient texts, but little archaeology. Scholars debated where exactly the battle happened, how many really fought, whether Herodotus was right about the date coinciding with Salamis, September 22, 480 BC. Same day, Athens crushed the Persian fleet. The Greeks claimed divine coordination. Modern historians doubt it, but Diodorus placed Himera on the same day as Thermopylae in August. Different ancient sources, different dates, same message. 480 BC was the year the Greek world survived. Then, in 2007 and 2008, archaeologists working ahead of a new rail line near ancient Himera started finding bodies. Stefano Vassallo led the excavation for the Soprintendenza Archeologica di Palermo. Over 10,000 burials in Himera's western necropolis. Most were individual graves, spanning centuries, but 7 graves held multiple bodies. Mass burials, dozens of men in each pit, all adult males, all showing signs of violent trauma. One had a bronze spearhead embedded in his left side. Still there, 2,500 years later. Another showed sword cuts to the skull, arrowheads found among the bones, 18 horses buried near the soldiers, still wearing bronze harness rings in their mouths. These weren't plague victims, these were soldiers. The graves dated to the 5th century BC. Their location in the western necropolis, just outside the western city wall, matched the ancient accounts. Diodorus said the main battle happened west of Himera, when Gelon's army marched around the south end of the city to attack the Carthaginian land camp. Bodies are heavy. You bury them close to where they fell, especially when you have hundreds to dispose of. The Greeks honored their dead, but they were practical. Mass graves for the fallen, individual tombs for citizens. The western necropolis graves had to be from Himera's battles. The city fought twice, 480 BC against Hamilcar, 409 BC against Hannibal Mago. 7 mass graves traced to those 2 conflicts. Anthropologists and forensic specialists analyzed the remains, modern archaeological techniques, skeleton density measured, positions documented, conservation protocols followed, until these excavations. Only a handful of Greek battle mass graves had been found. Chaeronea in 338 BC, where Philip of Macedon defeated the Greeks. Marathon from 490 BC. None had been excavated with modern methods. Himera was the first. The bones revealed ages, health, nutrition, battle trauma patterns. One detail jumped out. These men were healthy, well-fed, no signs of disease or malnutrition. Not slaves, not the urban poor, professional soldiers. If you want to know who these men really were, subscribe. This is documented history with archaeological proof, not speculation. Also comment where you're watching from. The forensic analysis I'm describing comes from research published by Fabri, Schettino, and Vassallo in 2006, SAS. Anthropological data from studies by the University of Palermo published in 2012, and taphonomic analysis published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2020, examining skeleton density, and positioning, and trauma patterns in the 7 Himera mass graves. These studies are cited in peer-reviewed archaeological literature and form the basis for distinguishing between the 480 BC and 409 BC burials. Now back to the evidence. In 2021, most researchers published isotope analysis from tooth enamel of nearly 60 soldiers. Isotopes reflect local hydrology and geology where someone grows up. The data showed that most soldiers in the 409 BC graves were local, born in Sicily or nearby. But 3/4 of the soldiers in the 480 BC graves were non-local. They grew up far from Sicily. That supported ancient accounts. In 480 BC, Himera had help from Syracuse and Acragas. Gelon brought a huge force, including mercenaries. In 409 BC, Syracuse abandoned Himera. The city fought alone and lost. The isotope data matched the history perfectly. Then, in October 2022, a genomic study published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by researchers including David Reich from Harvard, Lori Rietzema from University of Georgia, Brittany Kyle from University of Northern Colorado, and Alyssa Mitnick, who led the genetic analysis, examined DNA from 16 soldiers in the 480 BC mass graves and 5 from the 409 BC graves. They compared genome-wide data against ancient and modern populations from across Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. Results were stunning. 9 soldiers from 480 BC had genetic origins far beyond Greece and Sicily. 1 came from the Balkans, 2 from northeastern Europe, modern Latvia or Lithuania. 2 showed ancestry from the Eurasian steppes, Central Asia, DNA similar to Scythian populations. 1 had mitochondrial DNA matching modern Russia, Kazakhstan, or Mongolia. Another matched Central European ancestry. These men traveled thousands of miles to fight at Himera. The genomic diversity was unprecedented for classical Greek battles. Greeks had written their own version of Himera. Heroic citizen soldiers defending the homeland. Diodorus mentioned that Gelon gathered foreign mercenaries but downplayed their role. Herodotus wrote about Greek unity and courage. They built a narrative. DNA told a different story. The army that saved Himera in 480 BC was multi-ethnic. Professionals hired from the edges of the known world, men from the Baltic forests, steppe nomads, Thracian warriors. They came for pay. They fought for Syracuse. They died on Sicilian soil and got buried with respect in mass graves. Contrast that with 409 BC. All 5 soldiers from that battle's mass graves showed genetic ancestry from Greece and Sicily, no distant origins, no mercenaries. Himera stood alone that time. When Hannibal Mago besieged the city, Syracuse sent a general named Diocles with troops, but halfway through the siege, Diocles marched his men out at night and abandoned the city. He took half the garrison. Syracusan ships evacuated some women and children. Not enough. The next day, Iberian troops in Hannibal's army forced a gap in the wall. The Carthaginian army poured through. The city fell. Hannibal sacrificed 3,000 Greek prisoners at the spot where his grandfather Hamilcar died in 480 BC. Revenge completed. Himera was destroyed. Never rebuilt. Survivors founded a new settlement called Thermae nearby. Mixed Greek and Phoenician population. Why does this matter? Because it exposes how history gets written. Greek historians celebrated their own people. They emphasized citizen soldiers, hoplites defending the polis. That's the ideal. That's the story that lasts. But warfare was expensive and brutal. Professional soldiers cost money, but they won battles. Gelon understood that. He hired 10,000 mercenaries before Himera. Settled them in Syracuse between 485 and 480 BC, gave them citizenship. That inscription from Praxiteles of Mantinea at Olympia is one data point. DNA from mass graves is another. Hard evidence that the battle Greeks celebrated as the triumph of Hellenism was actually won by a multi-ethnic mercenary army. Angelos Chaniotis, a Greek historian, noted that ancient texts mention mercenaries but minimize their importance. The heroic narrative required Greek citizens as the heroes. Mercenaries fought for money, not civic duty. That didn't fit the ideal, so it got written out or downplayed. Himera became another Thermopylae, or marathon in Greek memory. Pure Greek valor against foreign invaders. The mass graves tell the truth. 7 men from places Greeks considered barbaric fought alongside Sicilian Greeks and died protecting a city most of them had probably never seen until they arrived with Gelon's army. They got respectful burial, not in private tombs, but in communal graves with their comrades. That's the real story. The ancient sources matter. Diodorus Siculus describes the cavalry ruse in detail. The letter from Selinus, the timing of Hamilcar's sacrifice. Herodotus gives different details about Hamilcar's death but confirms the date and outcome. Multiple sources, multiple perspectives, same core facts. Big Carthaginian invasion, Greek victory, Hamilcar dead, fleet burned, 70-year Carthaginian absence from Sicily. Archaeology fills the gaps. The 7 mass graves confirm violent death in battle. The western necropolis location confirms fighting west of the city. The horse burials with bronze harness gear confirm cavalry action. 19 buried horses near the soldiers. Cavalry was decisive at Himera. Gelon's riders captured foragers, infiltrated the naval camp, killed Hamilcar, burned ships. Horses died too. They got buried with honor near the men who rode them. That's respect for the tools of war. The genomic data from October 2022 adds precision. Not just mercenaries from far away, but specific ancestral origins. Latvia, Balkans, Eurasian steppe, Central Europe. These are real places, real migration routes. Real people who traveled incredible distances in an age when most humans never went more than 50 miles from their birthplace. How did they get there? Overland trade routes, probably. Slavers buying prisoners from tribal conflicts and selling them south. Recruiters traveling north, offering gold for fighting men. Word of mouth. Syracuse was rich. Gelon was hiring. Men who could fight had options. Some took them. The 5 soldiers from 409 BC tell the other half. Local boys. Greeks and cycles. No reinforcements. No mercenaries. Himera fought with what it had and lost. Hannibal Mago brought 50,000 troops after conquering Selinus. Himera couldn't match that. Syracuse refused to commit. Diocles abandoned them. The city fell. 3,000 prisoners executed. The survivors scattered. The city erased. Different outcome when the mercenaries aren't coming. Carthage paid 2,000 silver talents after 480 BC. That's a staggering sum. 1 talent weighed about 26 kilograms. 2,000 talents equals 52,000 kilograms of silver. Over 50 metric tons. The Romans would later demand similar indemnities. 2,200 talents after the First Punic War in 241 BC. 3,200 talents after renegotiation. 10,000 talents after the Second Punic War in 201 BC, paid over 50 years. Carthage understood defeat meant payment. 2,000 talents in 480 BC bought peace for 7 decades. Carthage rebuilt, focused on Africa and Iberia. Let Sicily go. That peace ended when internal Greek conflicts weakened Syracuse. By 410 BC, the balance had shifted. Segesta asked Carthage for help against Selinus. Hannibal Mago invaded. He sacked Selinus in 409 BC, then marched on Himera, even though the Carthaginian Senate hadn't ordered it. Personal vendetta. His grandfather died there. He wanted revenge. He got it. Then Carthage came back in force. Wars in 406 BC, 398 BC, 382 BC. Syracuse fought them all. Dionysius the Elder ruled Syracuse for 38 years and spent most of them fighting Carthage. The island became a battleground again. The 70-year peace was over, but 480 BC remains the turning point. If Hamilcar wins at Himera, Carthage likely controls all of Sicily within a decade. Syracuse falls. Greek colonies collapse or submit. Carthage becomes the dominant Mediterranean power in the West, decades earlier than it did historically. That changes everything. Rome is still a minor city-state fighting Etruscans in 480 BC. A Carthage controlling Sicily in the 5th century BC means a Carthage with more resources, more ports, more strategic depth when it eventually clashes with Rome. Different timeline, different outcomes. But Hamilcar lost 20,000 Greeks with mercenary support, defeated a larger Carthaginian force through tactical deception and coordinated timing. Gelon's cavalry ruse worked. The ships burned. Hamilcar died. The Carthaginian army routed. Syracuse survived and thrived. Greek culture dominated Sicily for generations. That's the strategic impact. It kept the Western Mediterranean divided between Greek and Carthaginian spheres long enough for Rome to rise. By the time Carthage and Rome fought the Punic Wars, Syracuse was a Roman ally in the First Punic War and a target in the Second. The political landscape had shifted again, but the foundation was laid at Himera in 480 BC. The Battle of Himera is one of the most important battles nobody remembers. It gets overshadowed by Thermopylae and Salamis because those battles happened in Greece proper, and ancient Greek historians focused on mainland events. Himera was colonial. Sicilian, Western. It didn't fit the narrative of Athens and Sparta saving civilization, but it mattered just as much. More, in some ways, because it secured the western flank while the mainland Greeks fought Persia. If Carthage conquers Sicily, suddenly mainland Greece faces threats from two directions. Persian Empire in the east, Carthaginian Empire in the west. That's a death sentence. Himera prevented it. The archaeological evidence from 2007 through 2022 brought the battle back from legend into documented fact. Mass graves, violent trauma, isotope analysis proving non-local origins, genomic sequencing identifying specific ancestral populations, 19 horse burials confirming cavalry engagement. These aren't interpretations. These are measurements, data points, physical evidence supporting and enriching ancient texts. Vassallo's excavation team worked with anthropologists, geneticists, conservators, architects, multidisciplinary approach, modern archaeology at its best. Other details matter too. The Temple of Victory built at Himera after the battle. Gelon dedicated a monument at Delphi spreading news of the victory to the wider Greek world. Coins minted in Syracuse showing quadrigas, four-horse chariots, celebrating military success. These material traces confirm the ancient accounts. Carthage really did pay the indemnity. Gelon really did use the spoils for public building. Syracuse really did become the leading Greek power in Sicily for the next century. The western necropolis continues to yield information. Over 2,000 burials spanning the 6th to 5th centuries BC excavated since the early 1990s. Only 16 contained multiple individuals, 7 linked to the battles. The rest were standard single burials, showing normal cemetery use over time. That makes the mass graves stand out. Clear markers of crisis events, sudden influx of dead needing rapid burial. The Greeks treated their war dead with respect but practicality. Individual tombs for citizens who could afford them. Mass graves for soldiers who died together. Simple calculus of honor and logistics. One skeleton had the spearhead still embedded. 2,500 years and the weapon was still in the bone. That tells you about penetration force, the angle of entry, the lethality of Greek and Carthaginian infantry combat at close range. Hoplites used 8-foot spears with bronze or iron points. They thrust over shields aiming for gaps in armor, throat, armpit, groin, anywhere unprotected. That spearhead found its mark and the man died. His body went into the mass grave with dozens of others. The spear stayed in his ribs until archaeologists found him in 2008. Another skeleton showed multiple blade wounds to the skull, sword, or axe, repeated impacts. That's what happens when formations break and fighting becomes personal. No organized line. Just men trying to kill each other. The soldier took several hits to the head before going down. Heavy trauma. Probably died instantly on one of them. His body also went into the pit. These details aren't pretty, but they're real. This is what ancient warfare looked like on the ground. Not the heroic duels of epic poetry, chaotic violence, mass casualties, bodies piled up and buried in haste. The horses buried nearby add another layer. Cavalry was expensive. Horses cost money to breed, train, feed. Only wealthy citizens or well-funded mercenary units could afford them. The 19 horses found near the mass graves died in battle or were so badly wounded they had to be killed, bronze harness rings still in their mouths. These were working war horses, fast enough to raid, strong enough to charge, smart enough to respond to commands in combat. They died doing their job. The Greeks buried them near the soldiers they served. That's recognition of their value. Gelon's cavalry won Himera. They captured foragers. They intercepted the messenger from Selinus. They infiltrated the naval camp. They killed Hamilcar. They burned the ships. They signaled Gelon to attack. Without them, the battle plays out differently. Probably still a Greek victory because Gelon had numerical advantage once he arrived, but not the decisive rout, not the destruction of Carthage's fleet, not the death of their commander. The cavalry made the difference. That's why 5,000 cavalry rode with Gelon's army according to ancient sources. Syracusan cavalry was legendary. Sicilian Greeks built their military power around mounted troops. The island's terrain and economy supported it. They raised horses. They trained riders. They used them ruthlessly. The Carthaginians' storm losses hurt them badly. Most transports carrying horses and chariots sank crossing from North Africa. That eliminated Hamilcar's own cavalry and his chariot corps. Libyan four-horse war chariots were elite units. Heavy shock weapons. They needed flat ground and they needed support. Without cavalry screens, chariots were vulnerable. Without chariots and cavalry, Hamilcar's army lost mobility. They couldn't scout effectively, couldn't raid Greek supply lines, couldn't counter Gelon's horsemen. That storm changed everything before the battle even started. Poseidon favoring the Greeks, if you believe Diodorus. Tactical disaster, if you look at the practical impact. Hamilcar tried to compensate by requesting cavalry from Selinus. That letter was his attempt to rebuild mounted strength. Selinus was a Greek city, but Carthaginian aligned. They'd send cavalry if asked, but the letter got intercepted. Gelon's riders captured the messenger, read the request, saw the opportunity. That moment decided the battle. One captured letter led to the entire cavalry ruse. Gelon's men disguised themselves, approached from the direction of Selinus, got admitted to the naval camp, and killed Hamilcar. If that messenger gets through, Selinus sends real cavalry, Hamilcar gets his reinforcements, the naval camp doesn't fall, and Gelon has to win by conventional assault. A harder fight, more casualties, maybe still a Greek victory, but not the crushing rout. Small moments, a letter captured, a sentry fooled, a commander killed, a fleet burned. That's how battles turn. Hamilcar made one mistake. He wrote down his plan and sent it through enemy territory. Gelon exploited it perfectly. That's generalship. Spotting the opening, acting fast, coordinating the deception with the main assault, trusting his cavalry to pull it off. They did. Hamilcar died at his own sacrifice. The flames meant for Poseidon consumed Carthaginian warships instead. Poetic, brutal, war. In 2022, researchers wrote that the findings shed light on warfare as a mechanism for cultural contact. Soldiers, especially mercenaries, were long-distance carriers of ideas, technologies, languages, and genes. That's the big picture. Men from Latvia and the Balkans and Central Asia came to Sicily. Some survived and stayed, some died and got buried. Either way, they brought their cultures with them. Language fragments, religious practices, fighting techniques, trade connections. The mixing happened whether people noticed or not. Himera wasn't just Greeks versus Carthaginians. It was a collision of Mediterranean, African, and also European populations. Now the genetics prove it. That makes Himera a microcosm of ancient Mediterranean warfare. Professional armies drawn from everywhere, financed by rich city-states, fighting for territory, trade, and pride. Syracuse and Carthage hired specialists from across the known world. Nobody fought with purely local troops at this scale. You needed archers, slingers, heavy infantry, cavalry. Mix them together, train them, pay them, win battles. The 2,000 talent indemnity funded Syracuse's golden age. Public buildings, fleet expansion, more mercenaries. Gelon died in 478 BC, but his brother Hieron took over. Hieron won at Cumae in 474 BC against the Etruscans. Syracuse dominated the western Mediterranean for decades. That dominance started at Himera. When Carthage came back in 409 BC, the situation had changed. Syracuse was weaker. Internal conflicts. Tyrants overthrown and restored. The Greeks weren't united anymore. Himera stood alone. That's why it fell. Hannibal Mago had learned the lessons. Bring overwhelming force. Build siege equipment. Don't rely on allies. Crush resistance fast. He did. Selinus fell in 409 BC after a short siege. Himera fell the same year. Both cities destroyed. Populations killed or enslaved. Carthage announced it was back. The wars resumed. Syracuse fought Carthage on and off for another century and a half until Rome entered the picture. But 480 BC remained the baseline. The moment when Syracuse proved it could beat Carthage. The template for later conflicts, Gelon became the model for future Syracusan rulers. Timoleon in 344 BC modeled himself on Gelon. Agathocles in the late 4th century BC referenced Himera when facing Carthaginian invasions. The battle entered Greek mythology alongside Marathon and Salamis, shared Greek victory, defense of Hellenism against barbarians. The narrative stuck for 2 millennia. Only now, with mass graves excavated and DNA sequenced, can we see the full picture. The battle was real, the casualties were real, the strategic impact was real, but the army that won was more diverse than anyone admitted. Himera was saved by a coalition of Greeks and non-Greeks fighting for pay under a tyrant who understood power. That's less romantic than citizen hoplites defending their homeland. But it's what happened. The bones don't lie. The DNA doesn't lie. The isotopes don't lie. September 22, 480 BC. A date buried in the shadow of Salamis and Thermopylae. Yet on that day, on a coastal plain in Sicily, 20,000 Greeks and their mercenary allies destroyed the largest Carthaginian army assembled to that point. They killed the enemy commander, burned his fleet, secured Sicily for Greek culture, bought 70 years of peace, built temples and monuments, changed the trajectory of Mediterranean history, and then they buried their dead in mass graves west of the city and forgot about the mercenaries who bled for them, until archaeologists came looking, until geneticists started sequencing DNA, until researchers asked uncomfortable questions about who really fought at Himera and why Greek historians wrote them out of the story. Now we know. The battle was won by professionals from the edges of the world. men whose names we'll never know, men whose descendants are scattered across Europe and Asia, men who died for Syracuse and got a respectful burial in foreign soil. That's the real story of Hamilcar, not the glory of Greek civilization, the grim calculus of ancient power. Hire the best, pay them well, win battles. Write history the way you want it remembered, but bury the truth where archaeologists might find it 2,500 years later. The western necropolis at Hamilcar holds over 10,000 graves, 7 mass burials from 2 battles, hundreds of individual soldiers, thousands of civilians across centuries, all waiting beneath Sicilian soil, only a fraction excavated so far. More remains underground, more data locked in bones and earth. The rail line construction exposed a small section. Archaeologists did what they could before the work continued, but the site is still there, still holding answers. Future excavations will find more soldiers, more trauma patterns, more DNA, more stories about who fought and why and where they came from. That's the power of archaeology. It doesn't care about narrative. It measures, it tests. It reports Hamilcar was a Greek victory according to ancient texts, and a Greek victory according to archaeology, but the soldiers in the mass graves came from Latvia and the Balkans and Central Asia according to genetics. Both things are true. Greeks won the battle. Non-Greeks helped them win it. That's not a contradiction. That's history at ground level, complicated, messy, human. 20,000 Greeks destroyed 50,000 Carthaginians in 480 BC. That's the headline. The detail underneath is that Greek meant citizens, allies, and hired professionals from across Europe and beyond. The detail underneath that is 3/4 of them weren't from Sicily. The detail underneath that is they fought well enough to save the city and die in the process. The detail underneath that is they got buried with honor and forgotten for 2 millennia until scientists dug them up and read their DNA. That's the other 480 BC upset. Not just military victory, historical amnesia, selective memory, and archaeological resurrection of truth. In 2022, David Reich from Harvard said, genetics and isotopic analysis corroborate and enrich the historical accounts and archaeological evidence. Brittany Kyle from University of Northern Colorado said, it's such a clear example of how different lines of evidence come together. Alyssa Mitnick, who led the genetic analysis, said the extreme genetic diversity in a single burial context is unprecedented for this period of classical history. And they're right. 7 mass graves, 16 soldiers sequenced from 480 BC, 9 showing distant origins. That's over half. That's not a few mercenaries filling gaps. That's the army's backbone. Professional soldiers hired from everywhere, fighting for pay, winning battles, changing history, then disappearing from the record until DNA brought them back. Hamilcar wasn't unique. Every major Greek and Carthaginian army used mercenaries. Syracuse hired thousands. Carthage hired tens of thousands. Athens hired Scythian archers. Sparta hired Helot support troops. Persia hired Greek hoplites. The ancient Mediterranean ran on professional violence. But historians emphasized citizen soldiers because that's the ideal. That's the civic virtue. That's the story that builds cultural identity. Mercenaries complicate the narrative. They fight for money, not patriotism. They come from barbaric places. They don't fit the heroic mold. So they get downplayed, mentioned briefly, then forgotten, until archaeologists prove they were there in force, until geneticists show they came from Latvia, until the comfortable story of Greek valor cracks and the complicated story of ancient warfare emerges. That's what makes Hamilcar matter now, not just as a battle, as a lesson in how history gets constructed. Ancient historians had agendas. They wanted to celebrate Greek culture. They wanted to inspire Greek unity. They wanted to show that civilization defeated barbarism. So they emphasized the Greek heroes and minimized the foreign professionals. They weren't lying. Gelon was Greek, Theron was Greek, the officers were Greek, the strategy was Greek, but the soldiers were international. The army that executed the strategy and won the battle was multi-ethnic. That's the truth the mass graves reveal. That's what 2,500 years of burial preserves. That's what modern science recovers. The western necropolis at Hamilcar, 7 mass graves, hundreds of soldiers, 19 horses, 1 spearhead embedded in ribs, multiple skull fractures, bronze harness rings, tooth enamel isotopes showing foreign origins, DNA matching populations from Latvia to Central Asia, all buried together west of the city where the Carthaginian land camp stood, where Gelon's army marched after the signal from the burning ships, where the battle raged from dawn to dusk on September 22, 480 BC, where 50,000 Carthaginians broke and ran, where 2,000 years of history waited in the ground for archaeologists with modern tools to find it, where the real story of Hamilcar was always buried, waiting, patient, true.